raise some issues. So we'll go to planning and zoning. We'll start with Jeff. And the question is, what do you feel is the role of land use regulation in town? And how do you feel that, this question is not written right, and how do you feel the interaction of property rights of property owners in that perspective?
Well, I have two things to start out with that, in my answer. One is, that is a loaded question, because that's where a lot of the challenge comes into with regards to what we do on planning and zoning. But the other aspect is, that's also where a lot of the excitement comes in, because if you really take a look at what we do with planning and zoning, it all is around use of land, naturally. And not just use of land that people want to do now, but what might people want to do in the future. Things that we know they might want to do, but also things we're not even aware of. Who would have thought 50 years ago when planning and zoning people were thinking about lots of commercial and industrial development going in town, that now we're having to think of regulations for the average homeowner wanting to put in a solar power array or a windmill generator. These are actual things that we on the commission have to look at. In fact, Brooklyn is already looking into that and already has meetings on that and drafting up things. And so there's a lot of things that change, but the basic denominator comes down to you have to respect individual property rights, which is a fundamental thing, not just legally, but in the fabric of this society. You can go all the way back to some of the reasons that we had the American Revolution in the first place, but also very much looking at the whole community. We have to have regulations. I have people who ask me, well, why do you spend hour after hour, month after month, literally year after year, looking at all sorts of regulations? And the reason is, we have to. Just imagine if you don't have regulations. You would have such haphazard growth. You'd have so many incompatible things next to each other that no one would want to live in a town like that. And in fact, if you go back to the turn of, well actually, it's really the turn of a couple centuries ago, in the early 1900s, when there really wasn't zoning, people got all up in arms when lots of big factories were being built next to residential neighborhoods. That's really where residential zoning came from in this country. It turned into a lot of other things in New York City and big cities. So what it really comes down to when we take a look at trying to answer a question like that is you have to have a bunch of fundamentals that you have to base your decisions upon, which are the zoning regulations. We need zoning regulations to try to guide growth, but we don't want to have zoning regulations, and I feel strongly about this, but you don't want to have unnecessarily burdensome zoning regulations that are going to befuddle and limit land uses that we need and that people can do legally with their own property. On the other hand, there is nothing wrong at all, and I believe this strongly as well, to having good zoning regulations that everyone needs to follow, but having zoning regulations that have a lot of flexibility. Because we could say we want to have X, Y, and Z zoning regulations in one part of Woodstock, but what may apply in that part of Woodstock may not necessarily apply to that same type of land use in another part of Woodstock. So you do have to have some degree of flexibility. Again, that gets back to practical common sense to make certain that things can happen that people by right can do. But we also want to make certain that we have some overarching regulations. We do with the regulations we have now. There's a lot of work the Commission is doing, thinking about new types of regulations. We're drafting up commercial regulations to try to guide that. I use the term guide as opposed to regulate because that's a better way of thinking about it. There's a lot of talk about different types of overlay zones to protect different types of parts of town, different types of natural resources such as aquifer overlay zones and other types of overlay zones that different towns do, and do them well because of unique things in their town. It gives you a lot of flexibility. The challenge with that is you've got to keep it on straight. And that's where you have to come up with regulations that, number one, the Commission can understand. Because if we don't understand it, I can't imagine, an average homeowner would. Number two, you have to be able to enforce them. Because if we have rules and we don't enforce them, what good is there to have rules? And in fact, the Commission does take stands at time in trying to enforce regulations. And if that means we have to take legal action, we take legal action to enforce the rules of the town. And the third thing is you want to make certain that the regulations are easy for people to understand and to follow. Because the worst thing you can do is you can set up regulations that the average person can't follow, and then they get into trouble. And we don't want to go after those types of people. We want to help guide what the average homeowner and the average business owner would like to do and make it fit into Woodstock. And do it in a way where the regulatory process is not cumbersome, is easy, is user-friendly. One of the things we do on the commission is we have an agenda item called preliminary discussion, where we can invite applicants to come in. It could be a homeowner that wants to add on to his or her house. It could be a new business that wants to move into town. They haven't submitted an application. They discuss with us their ideas. We can discuss with them the regulations. What do we think about their proposal? They have information they need to come to us with an actual application. Saves them a lot of time, saves them a lot of money, saves us a lot of time. And in the end, everybody, so to speak, can get what they want as far as things that they want to do and things we want to do, and how to bring things into Woodstock. One of the ways that really is needed is not just for the average homeowner, but think about economic development. And I'll jump a little bit over to the Board of Ed. Public education requires money. And it's always an issue with budgets. I don't need to tell you that that's always an issue with budgets. A lot of it does fall onto homeowners, but one of the tricks in towns and cities is how do you bring in appropriate and sustainable economic development? And not just say we're going to bring in some gigantic factory or a gigantic mall or 10 trillion gas stations and we're going to get revenue. Some towns do that and then realize that changes the character of the town way too much. But how do you bring that in to a town of Woodstock, for example? And the way you do that is through the regulations. And before you do the regulations, you have to plan. And some of the things you'll hear us say in the commission, I didn't invent it. Our town planner says this a lot, is you got to plan before you zone. And you'll see us wear the planning hat and the zoning hat. And people may not always see us switch those hats, but we have a combined board. We're planning and zoning. Not all towns have a combined board. So sometimes we're planning and thinking about what needs to be done. And then other times we're zoning. We actually write the regulations that are the quote-unquote law of the town as far as development and land use goes. So for me, as far as balancing the two, that is a never-ending challenge for us to face. I think the way we've been doing it with our strategic plan the commission has is really spelling out a good process to think about it and try to be proactive. We don't want to be reactionary. But at the end of the day, we have to go with the regulations that we have in existence and follow them consistently and in a good legal manner so that it's fair to everyone. But it does not stop us at the same time for thinking ahead what we want to do. And so there's a lot that we do in that regard, and it never ends. And I don't think it ever will, because everything changes over time as it always has, and we always going to be constantly thinking about the present and the future. And one of the other things, and I'll end that with my final comment, is not just should we be thinking of the future, but you've got to take a look at what's happened in the past, because there's a lot of good examples of things that have worked in this town that we don't have to reinvent the wheel on. We can update them or adapt them to current times. There's also things that have not worked, and you don't want to fall into the same mistake. And so we do go back and take a look and find out from people and investigate what has happened in the past so we can make things moving forward all that much better.
Any question?